What if I told you that the greatest manufacturing boom in human history didn't start in a boardroom, or a factory, or a Silicon Valley garage, but in a quiet Washington office, with a single bureaucratic decision? That the United States, once the world's leading producer of automobiles, stopped making cars almost overnight, not because of a market crash or a strike, but because the government told it to. And even more surprising, the companies obeyed, willingly, eagerly. Why? This is the story of how America's economy was commandeered, planned, allocated, and controlled from the top down, and how it worked. This is the story of the War Production Board, and it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What happens when capitalism and command economies collide, and it works? Before we dive into the factories, let's set the stage. The year is 1942. The United States has just entered World War II. Pearl Harbor is still fresh in the national psyche. Panic is high, trust is fragile, and one question looms over Washington. Can we mobilize the economy fast enough to win this war? The problem isn't a lack of resources. America has steel, rubber, oil, it has factories and railroads, but it also has a capitalist economy, one designed to maximize profit, not produce weapons. Left to market forces, companies would keep making the things they know how to sell. Cars, appliances, consumer goods. That doesn't help when you need tanks, bombers, and bullets. So the Roosevelt administration does something radical. It creates the War Production Board, a powerful centralized agency with one job: take control of the American economy and retool it for total war. It wasn't the first attempt. Earlier efforts like the Office of Production Management had lacked teeth, but the WPB, created by executive order in January 1942, came with real authority. It could allocate materials, prohibit civilian production, prioritize military contracts, and even dictate who got electricity and fuel. At the head of this operation, Donald M. Nelson. A former Sears executive, Nelson wasn't a general or a politician. He was a businessman who knew supply chains, understood logistics, and critically knew how to talk to industry. That would matter more than anyone expected. Let's walk through how this unprecedented economic takeover played out and how it succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. It started with allocations. The WPB's first job was to take stock. What raw materials were available? Who needed them? What production could be paused? What had to ramp up? Steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, these became strategic assets. If you were a company and you wanted any of them, you had to apply for it. And if you weren't building something the military needed, you weren't getting it. Civilian car production, gone. In February 1942, the last private automobile rolled off the assembly line. From that moment forward, Detroit, the heart of America's industrial power, would build tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Ford stopped making cars and started mass-producing B-24 Liberators, the heavy bombers that would fly over Europe. General Motors retooled its plants to churn out tanks, guns, and parts for naval ships. Chrysler made engines and munitions. Even typewriter manufacturers began producing rifles. And this wasn't a slow shift. By mid-1942, more than 40% of US manufacturing was dedicated to war production. By 1943, civilian manufacturing was essentially frozen. Why did the corporations comply? In short, because it was profitable. The WPB didn't seize factories. It didn't nationalize industries. It offered contracts, lucrative ones, with guaranteed costs and profit margins. The government bore the financial risk. Companies just had to deliver. For many executives, the war became good business. Profits rose, factories expanded, and perhaps most importantly, corporate leaders saw themselves as part of something bigger. This was not just capitalism. This was patriotic capitalism. But there was a catch. To meet production goals, America needed more than corporate buy-in. It needed workers, and fast. That meant reshaping the labor force itself. Enter the second great transformation of the war economy, the workforce. With millions of men drafted and sent overseas, labor shortages hit every sector. The solution was twofold: women and migration. The iconic Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. Between 1940 and 1945, The percentage of women in the workforce jumped from 27% to nearly 37%. For the first time, women took up jobs in shipyards, steel mills, and aircraft plants, roles traditionally reserved for men. At the same time, the Great Migration accelerated. Black Americans, long confined to segregated jobs in the South, moved north and west in huge numbers. Cities like Detroit, Los Angeles, and Chicago swelled as workers poured into wartime factories. It wasn't smooth. Discrimination remained rampant. Many unions resisted integration. Race riots broke out in places like Detroit in 1943. But the shift was undeniable. America's labor force had changed forever. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Incomes rose. For many, the war was the first taste of real economic opportunity. By 1944, the scale of American war production was staggering. The US was producing 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and millions of rifles, grenades, and uniforms. Every month, America's GDP more than doubled during the war. Unemployment dropped to under 2%. The Allies didn't win the war on the battlefield alone. They won it in the factories. They won it in the assembly lines, retooled by the War Production Board. But no system scales forever. And by 1945, as victory seemed inevitable, the question turned, what now? The war was ending. The economy, still under command control, needed to pivot again, but this time in reverse. This was the breaking point. Reconversion, the shift from war production back to a peacetime economy, proved harder than anyone predicted. Factories needed to retool again. Workers, especially women and Black Americans, faced job losses as soldiers returned. Demand surged for consumer goods that hadn't been made in years: cars, appliances, homes. But supply chains were still structured for war. Worse, the WPB was slow to let go. Allocations continued. Red tape piled up. Confusion reigned. Who would get steel now? Who decided if a company could switch back to civilian goods? A new agency, the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion, tried to take the reins. But the magic of centralized planning didn't translate so well to a booming consumer economy. Planning shortages was one thing. Planning abundance was another. The American public grew impatient. Companies lobbied for freedom. Workers went on strike. The war economy, once a miracle of coordination, began to falter under its own weight. By 1946, the War Production Board was dissolved. Its offices closed. Its files boxed up. And the economy, now largely unshackled, entered a new era of capitalist expansion. But not everyone forgot. Economists, policymakers, and business leaders studied the WPB for decades. How had it worked? Why had industry cooperated so fully? Could it be replicated? There were attempts. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, the government imposed gas rationing and price controls. In the 2008 financial crisis, it bailed out banks and automakers. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Defense Production Act was invoked to prioritize medical equipment manufacturing, but none of these efforts matched the scale or cohesion of the War Production Board. None restructured the entire economy in months. None had the same clarity of purpose: win the war or lose everything. And yet, the echoes remain. Consider this: in 1940, the US produced about 4 million cars. In 1943, it produced 139. Not 139,000. 139 cars total. The rest, tanks, trucks, and military vehicles. That level of industrial pivot has never been repeated, but with climate change, geopolitical tensions, and new pandemics looming, the question is resurfacing. Could it be done again? Could the government step in and redirect private industry? Not just for war, but for survival? Could it mandate the production of solar panels instead of SUVs? Ventilators instead of vape pens? And would corporations obey, as they once did? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us patterns. Here are 3 key takeaways. First, crisis reveals capacity. The US economy was not inherently incapable of mass production. It simply needed a reason, a structure, and a shared goal. Once given those, it outperformed every other economy on Earth. Second, planning and profit are not mutually exclusive. The WPB didn't abolish capitalism. It aligned it. By guaranteeing profits and providing direction, it got industry to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. Third, social change follows economic shifts. The war effort pulled women and minorities into the workforce, but those gains were neither guaranteed nor permanent. When the economy shifted again, many were pushed back out. Progress requires intentional policy, not just opportunity. So where does that leave us? With a warning. Extraordinary coordination is possible, but only under extraordinary pressure. If we wait for crisis, we may be too late. If we want to replicate the success of the War Production Board, whether to fight climate change, rebuild infrastructure, or confront new threats, we need more than nostalgia. We need courage, we need clarity, and we need coordination before catastrophe. The story of the War Production Board is not just history, it's a mirror. One that asks, what are we willing to do when everything is on the line? If you found this story surprising, if it made you question what's possible when government and business align for a higher purpose, share it. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because the lessons of the past aren't just for textbooks, they're for us, right now.